To support this channel, please become a monthly donor on Subscribestar or check out the sponsor link in the video description for 15% off on all CBD products. Sweden's police have started banning Quran burnings due to security reasons. Internal documents show that they are only concerned about the Quran, and other religious books are not included in this ban. And here is where we get a very creepy window peek into what happens with democracy when it encounters multiculturalism. Integration is a word that's been used a lot in our social debate here in Sweden. Integration meaning Swedes and immigrants are supposed to adapt after each other. That was the goal they had initially, but instead we got a situation where Swedes do not adapt after immigrants. Instead, they adapt after a radical minority of Muslims who don't represent most immigrants. Sweden is a country where people take pride in being atheist and their secular traditions. At the same time, 42% of Sweden's population want to ban Quran burning. How does this even add up? There are as many people for the ban as there are against it. But the craziest thing is looking at Sweden's so-called right-wing parties. Only 56% of Sweden Democrats think you should be allowed to burn the Quran. What does this even mean? That 44% of Swedish conservatives think like Islamists? You'll find similar high numbers in the other parties. 48% of Social Democrats and 47% of Center Party liberals want to ban Quran protests. I mean, that's certainly not strange. To have that high level of support for censorship is exactly what you would expect from the parties who have had the most Islamist scandals over the past decade. But what I find strange is how high the support for censorship is amongst the Swedish public in general. And it's also alarming when you consider there's really only one party pushing this as a clear agenda, and that is the recently started Islamist party called Nuance. And if you happen to find that name hilarious, then you're not the only one. In fact, if you look up the meaning of irony in the dictionary, you'll find a picture of religious radicals talking about the need for level-headed nuance. This is highly typical of Islamists, the game they play of faking liberal values and using democracy against itself. The party Nuance have said that Swedish law needs to be changed so people aren't allowed to burn the Quran or draw pictures of Muhammad, and Islamophobia should be written into law as a punishable crime. Oh, and of course, imams must be allowed to explain to the public why homosexuality is forbidden. We can't have any controversy with that. That's just common sense, according to this party. And this party is now bigger than the Christian Democrats in Malmö. It's pretty crazy that a recently started fringe party of extremists has more support in immigrant-dominated areas of Sweden than a party that's currently in parliament. In the ghetto of Rosengård, the party Nuance got 31% of votes in the local election, making them the second biggest party after the Social Democrats. Nuance have broad support in several of Sweden's ghettos, and with this it's official that political Islam is on the rise in Sweden. And it's scary how many Swedish people support one of their main political causes, which is essentially to ban blasphemy, to ban the burning of the Quran. Typical of Islamism is that Muslims should have complete freedom of speech with no limitations and be allowed to insult anything from homosexuals to Jews, Christians, and atheists. But those who are critical against Islam should not be allowed freedom of speech, according to them. This here is a party that wants to abolish democracy by using democracy to preach about the need for nuance so that there can be less nuance with radicals in power. Very clown world. No wonder these guys get along so well with progressives. Their refusal to stick to any kind of coherency makes them pretty natural bedfellows. Here's a pretty telling quote about Sweden's situation by political scientist Åsa Lundgren. The day that a party like Nuance take place in our political arenas, we will have to deal with completely new conflict lines and alliances of interests in Swedish politics. Be prepared for this. Quote. Yeah, well, thanks to Swedish politicians, we may actually have to get prepared very, very soon. Let's cover what's been going on with Sweden lately. Ever since the Quran burnings made global headlines, several Muslim countries have been pissed with people burning the flag and using Twitter to call Sweden Islamophobic. Sweden especially offended Turkey's micro-dick dictator Erdogan, who's been using it to obstruct Sweden's entry into NATO, since the Quran burnings took place outside of the Turkish embassy in Sweden. This was perceived as a kind of provocation, and this also caused our so-called right-wing Prime Minister, Milhouse Kristersson, to panic. He took to Twitter and immediately apologized, refuses to stand up for freedom of speech, and when he's interviewed by the media, he doesn't even want to describe Erdogan as a dictator, since Milhouse needs to suck up to this Islamist dictator given the situation with NATO. Completely spineless, and exactly what you'd expect from a Swede. But it doesn't end there. Swedish police have also started banning new freedom of speech demonstrations because they're afraid of Muslim outrage, and heavy political players in Sweden now want to restrict freedom of speech. Former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Carl Bildt, for one, but also the Nationalist Party, the Sweden Democrats. They now made a suggestion to bring back old blasphemy laws that applied in Sweden up until 1971, making it illegal to insult national and religious symbols. So the Sweden Democrats want to change the Swedish constitution on freedom of speech to make it illegal to desecrate the Swedish flag. But this also reflects how Sweden would relate to desecration of religious symbols. So by trying to create a new political correctness where it's forbidden to insult Sweden, these so-called conservatives are playing into the hands of the religious radicals they normally pretend to be against. Sweden Democrats want to make it illegal with desecration of the flag because it expresses dislike towards Sweden and Swedish people. By that logic, I suppose my entire YouTube channel will soon become illegal, since I like to point out when Swedish people act like morons and bend over with spread cheeks for religious radicals. Seriously, creating a new kind of political correctness based on nationalism obviously isn't a solution to our problems, especially since Swedish people give you so many reasons to express disregard given how they run their country. But I guess this is just what people have been saying about the pendulum swing of political correctness. If it can go one way, then it can also go the other. As an immigrant, I just think it's sad what the Swedish attitude of neutrality has led to. It is such a toxic mixture we're talking about here, blending the Swedish man's obsession with equality and socialism together with radical Islam. We have a thing here called the law of Jante. This is basically a term to summarize Swedish social norms in a nutshell. You can call it their trademark cultural socialism. What you get then, in this situation, is a bunch of village idiots talking about how important it is to never judge anyone, since they don't want to be judged themselves, and how you mustn't ever offend anyone, since they're easily offended, and how everyone is worth the same, and the worst thing you can do is think you're better than someone else, or to cause social friction and make people uncomfortable. Right. That's Swedish virtues in a nutshell. So throw a bunch of feisty Islamists into that mix, and you'll end up with a bunch of blue-eyed dorks that are happy to give up their country and eradicate their own traditions because the alternative is just too uncomfortable. Too much friction. Too much fighting. After all, the most important thing is for everyone to get along. Yeah, it's the fact that the average Swede thinks like a toxic positivity kindergarten teacher that makes them perfect bedfellows for radicals. Because someone who thinks that neutrality is the highest virtue will obviously never take a stance against what is objectively wrong, immoral, and aggressive. And what you end up with then is a large percentage of Swedes that agree with Islamists on Quran burnings. Even in our anti-immigration right-wing nationalist party, the Sweden Democrats. After the Quran burnings that took place, Sweden's National Security Police has seen an increase in planned terror attacks aimed at Sweden. The religious demonstration actually put Sweden in the global spotlight for radical Islamists all over the world. So now our police is denying people's right to freedom of speech and the critique of religion because of this. In other words, Swedes are willing to give up their own traditions and their own laws as soon as there's butthurt terrorists. Why don't you become better at defending your country instead? And practicing zero tolerance towards people who think you can get your way with threats and violence. And this actually reflects a very ugly backbone in Swedish culture and this country's history, namely the myths created around Swedish neutrality. Really, it should be viewed as complete spinelessness. It is not because Swedish people are exceptionally intelligent and moral that the country hasn't been to war for 200 years. Sweden was a friend and direct ally of Nazi Germany, providing crucial funding and allowing them to travel freely throughout the country. Selling out to one of the most bloodthirsty empires in human history is how Swedes stayed out of the war. Meaning they didn't stay out of it, they just participated and on the wrong side to cover their own asses. So it's really gross how Swedish people take pride in being a peaceful country that prioritizes zero friction as some kind of proof that they're exceptionally civilized, when it's exactly that attitude that caused them to be neutral and avoid friction, even with mass murdering Nazis. The way Swedish people culturally obsess about compromise and equality directly reflects how the Swede reacts when he stands in the face of general tyranny. He arches back and tries to compromise. He seeks coexistence and understanding, solely so his own ass doesn't have to get uncomfortable, doesn't have to get hurt. All according to the cultural socialism dictating the law of Jante. So is anyone surprised that the threats from Islamists are being respected by Swedish people? The threat from Germans during World War II was respected as well. And the way Swedish people acted back then makes it clear they will always bend over to foreign threats, no matter what skin color they have. Sweden was actually planning on becoming an ally to the Soviet Union if it turned out that Hitler wasn't going to be successful. And it just goes to show how unfair it is that France has the global reputation of being frog-eating pussies. The way Sweden acted during the war was way more despicable. Here's a quote regarding the police's internal documents. Freedom of protest is strongly protected in Sweden's constitution, and it takes a lot for police to deny public gatherings. But the police created special guidelines in order to be able to ban specifically Quran burnings. In order to do this, they had to make an extensive interpretation of the law of public order. Basically, they feel Quran burnings run the risk of increasing terror threats against Sweden and go against Swedish national interests. This extensive interpretation means that it is no longer enough to maintain order and safety during a protest. Instead, they now have to consider the abstract risk of something happening later on as a consequence to the protest, in this case, Quran burnings. Pay attention to that wording there, national interests. That obviously refers to Sweden's desire to join NATO and how important it is to suck up to Islamists like Erdogan in order for that to happen. So, Swedish interests means pleasing the angry Muslims that are burning the Swedish flag, so Sweden can become a more integrated part of the globalist community. The actions of the police and our Prime Minister has made it clear that Swedish law and freedom of expression can be compromised for political goals. The same way that Sweden made it illegal for their newspapers to write critically about Hitler during World War II. Today, you're allowed to criticize Nazis all you want, but the so-called Swedish tradition of freedom of speech also disappeared for a while there during the 40s. Now, they just want to do the same with other kinds of radicals, namely suspend freedom of speech to make Islamists happy, since Nazis aren't trendy anymore. My point is simply, if a group of radicals notice that you can get your way by throwing around threats of terrorism, of course they're not gonna be more likely to stop being violent radicals. They will instead realize that their methods work as their threats are being respected by the establishment. And that means more political Islam in the long term, not less. And then Sweden will eventually become a caliphate where nobody can say that they were naive and didn't see it coming. What we have right now is a right-wing government sucking up to radicals with completely opposite values. I don't think I have to spell out what the consequences of that behavior could be. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me this far. If you enjoyed this video, then please share and consider supporting me with a donation, since this is my full-time job. If you support me on any of my payment platforms, then you also get access to my Discord server, where you're allowed to be critical of Islamists instead of having to suck up to them like Sweden does. Links are in the video description, and thank you for watching.
Cannabislight.se, the finest quality CBD products in Northern Europe. EU-regulated, non-psychoactive hemp oil, as well as buds and muscle recovery cream for the athletes. No THC, 100% legal, and you get 15% off on all products if you use the code ARIBLATTE. I personally endorse this company due to the high quality of their products. I know the people involved, they're very serious, very knowledgeable, and they know what they're doing. Make this your regular CBD provider, and you'll know what you're doing as well.